And we're back, and we're back, and we're back.
Yes.
Welcome to Activated, the Future of Content. This lovely voice that you hear this morning crooning to you on this cloudy morning in Washington, D.C. is your boy, OG Baca.
Oh.
No longer the hair naughty god body. I've dropped the top on them
That is true.
for the live stream.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
You
so
got a haircut.
we're changing things up for the wintertime. You know, it's about to be No Shave November, so I'm about to,
Is that gonna happen?
I'm going to try.
Yeah.
I'm going to try.
What's the theme for November? No shave?
No Shave November.
Oh. Is that Movember or something? Same thing. Okay. All right.
And so I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Miss
Fatima.
Fatima. We're gonna get you a.
Yeah, well, I guess I was Fati. I'm Fati Fatima.
And
Or
that-
Tima. Tima's
like platinum mommy,
my-
platinum hair mommy, and the other voice you hear today is our guest, a writer and philosopher, and thought leader, thought sharer. That we've met here at Eaton, and we love to bring in the people that we bounce a lot of ideas off of. So that's Mr. Barrett Holmes Pitner.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks. Yeah.
What's up, man?
I'm all those things.
So I wanted to bring Barrett on today because like I said, we've talked to him a lot. He's a member here at Eaton House. But we also started working with him recently on the launch of his think tank, the Sustainable Culture Lab, which we'll get into a little bit later. But, with launching the think tank, we've, launched a podcast. We've had a launch event. We produced a zine talking about many of the goals and philosophies that back up what the Sustainable Culture Lab is. And so, we're bringing Barrett on to break it down for us, talk about, where you're from, your history, how you came about these ideas, why you do the work that you do. And share some ideas about the world, man.
Yeah. So which question do you want me to start with?
So let's start with like the basics. What do you do? What is your work? Because you could say you wear a lot of hats, huh?
Yeah, I guess I do wear a lot of hats. Well, I guess let's see. It should be an interesting, simple question, but I'm a writer. I write a lot, but I would write about like race, culture, and politics, and my pieces would appear in the Daily Beast, the BBC, the Guardian, other places. But in my heart of hearts, even though I'm a writer, journalist, went to school for that, I was always a philosopher. And one of the big push and pulls with journalism is making sure that your voice doesn't shape the story too much, so that you can provide like an objective truth. And I've always aspired to do that with my journalistic work, but as you look at enough truth objectively, you kind of are able to see the world and see what's happening in a way that other people aren't going to be able to, because they're not getting that level of exposure. And so from that, I felt there's an obligation to articulate the truth that I see in a way that makes sense to people, and that becomes the development of philosophy and language to articulate how you see the world in a way that hopefully can help people move throughout the world in the best way they can. Because if you can't describe your environment, then it's going to be very difficult for you to live within it in a healthy way, because you won't actually know what's going on.
What's going on in that way. So let's talk about like your background. We talked about you're a writer, and I want to get to your philosophy a little bit later, but where are you from, and was there anything that kind of in your childhood that kind of shaped like your philosophy or like the work that it led you to do? Like, were you always a writer, or?
So no, I was not always a writer. I think in middle school and high school, English was probably the class I had the least amount of interest in. I was like
Really?
I was a math guy, and I liked soccer a bunch. So at a certain point, school was just like too easy, and so I just kind of cared more about sports than classes. But I'm from the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, Marietta, Georgia. It's a predominantly white community. I'm African American, and it was like the hotbed of Southern conservative thought. Like Newt Gingrich was my rep growing up. And, you know, once he left, the next rep then became the senator. And so it's still like that influential part of, you know, conservative thought that dominates the South and now kind of dominates American thinking. And so I think growing up in that environment where you kind of had the best, I guess you could say, of conservative belief.
Some AAA conservative belief.
Yeah, like the creme de la creme of conservative thought was what was shaping my upbringing, and it was very easy to look at that and say, this is just ridiculous. There's really no legitimacy in any of these arguments.
Would you say that, like, were you like indoctrinated into the thought, or did you always feel like you were like outside of that? Like, my experience wasn't like a part of that. Like, what was your view of that?
All right, so when you're a kid, you're not really aware of how you think. You just think, you know, like it kind of takes a while for you to wrap yourself around how your brain processes stuff, which it's a weird thing to say, but you kind of, the idea that you get to know yourself more when you're in your 20s than you did in your teens is because like you're more aware of how your brain has been processing information for like 2 decades.
Right.
And so when I got older, I realized that there was a moment when I was growing up that I think set me apart from all my contemporaries. And it wasn't something that I tried to manufacture. It's just how my brain saw the world, and how what happened was, at sometime in elementary school, for all African Americans in this predominantly white environment, there's a moment where you realize that you're getting discrimination or some sort of abuse just because of the color of your skin. It has nothing to do with anything that you've done or whatever. It's just you're black, and they feel the need to say that you aren't good at stuff or you can't get things. And at this point, I noticed that a lot of my classmates, my African American classmates, kind of went in one or two ways. They either internalized this, well, they internalized it both
ways.
Ways. But one of the ways was they internalized it and said, what can I do to like make myself better so that these white people don't do negative things to me? And then there was another group that internalized it and said, I'm not going to do anything that these white people say. I'm going to go in like another direction. I'm going to be distinctly something that's not white. And I looked at it, and I just thought that this notion that someone could say that I was bad at something for no reason apart from the color of my skin, which I have absolutely nothing to do with. Like, I didn't pick who my parents are. Right? I didn't pick where I live. Was just completely insane. And if they could make that determination off of that fact, then they could make any kind of determination about me at absolutely any time with zero substance. So I just, from like 4th grade, maybe 3rd grade, just thought that where I lived was the most absurd place ever. And nothing made any sense, and no one's opinion or mattered at all. There was like a template you had to follow where it's like, all right, I need to go to school and not get in trouble and do this stuff just so that like I don't like cause a hassle and make my life like
it's almost like difficult. You saw the wires or the like you saw the strings behind the puppets and just was like, I'll deal with it.
But for the longest time it was just, none of this makes any sense. The opinions of the people around me don't matter, because if they do matter, they feel empowered to change them at any minute. And if you don't have to stick to what you believe ever, or have any kind of consistency in what you think, then are you even thinking? Do I need to listen to anything that you say? And that's basically how I've thought since, I don't know, elementary school. And I didn't realize until in my 20s that rarely anyone else thought like that. I just thought like a bunch of people did.
So this overall led to like your development of your philosophy and like how you see the world.
100%. Yeah.
And so let's talk about now like what that philosophy is, because we've talked about, I think what's really dope about the conversations that we've had here is how we talk about applying language to experiences and things like that. So you introduced the word to me, and that word led to essentially a philosophy of how to live your life. Or how we could go through life. So let's talk about this word that you came up with. And let's take it back to what's the word, and then what influenced you to come up with this word, like the specific instance or what was going on that said, okay, I'm trying to figure this out, or what were you grappling with?
Okay, so I'm presuming that the word we're talking about is ethnocide, because I have a handful of words that I use now. So ethnocide. So this word, I came up with this word after a couple of years of really thinking and exploring this linguistic impediment that really kind of presented itself as I started writing my pieces more consistently, because as an opinion columnist, you put your ideas out there, and the hope is that the idea that you're conveying, other people will understand what you're trying to say. And that there's and also the hope is that there's a language to convey your idea, like, because objects and things in the world exist before there's a word to say what that is,
Right.
So the hope is that you can have a word to describe what's around you, but sometimes there may not be that word. So I was writing pieces and people were enjoying them, but not, the responses I would get would be kind of askew from what I expected, and that kind of enforced that I was seeing things slightly differently. And so then I wanted to modify my pieces to try to really succinctly articulate what I was trying to say.
And what wasn't connecting? Like, what do you think was going askew for the reader?
So it happened over like a series of articles, but the most noteworthy would probably be this one I wrote in August 2015. It was about Donald Trump. It was called, okay, this Trump thing isn't funny anymore, and it was the first mainstream piece to compare Donald Trump to fascism. And the point of the piece wasn't solely to say Donald Trump's a fascist like Mussolini or Hitler or whatever. It was to talk about how America is not alarmed about this type of fascism, and the reason we're not alarmed is because America has just had this kind of fascism forever. We just don't call it fascism.
Right.
So like the treatment that my ancestors in Charleston, South Carolina received in the 1850s, 60s, clearly before that when there was slavery, was akin to any kind of European fascism.
Yeah.
But we don't call that call that fascism in America. We just call that tradition or something,
Patriotism.
Right. And so I wrote the piece, and everyone really rallied around the idea that I'm comparing Donald Trump to these evil people in Europe, but that wasn't the point. The point was comparing him to the evil people that live in America,
that have always been
America
around.
produces, that we just don't call evil. And when you try to make a point that to me is so clear, and I think it's clear to me because from like elementary school I was just like, this is where I live is meaningless.
Right.
No, everything is here is crazy. To see so many people not get that that's what I was trying to say was quite alarming. And so then I just had spent a while just thinking about this and how to articulate how I see the world. And as I tried with like the existing norms of saying systemic racism or white supremacy or this, that, and the other, it wasn't resonating. So I decided that I needed to start looking for new words or developing words to describe what I saw. And that's where the word ethnocide came to be, because historically ethno isn't like your ethnicity as we talk about today, it's your culture.
Right.
And so I felt that America is a society that inside is like homicide or suicide. It means killing. And so like, ethnocide is the killing of culture. So I felt that America actually suffers from this destruction of culture, and that and it stems from the transatlantic slave trade, where the goal of that was to extract African people, destroy their culture, and then have a society based around this normalization of cultural destruction that impacts and influences everyone in the society. And that, I felt, succinctly articulated how I've always seen the world. And it's crazy to think it took 30 years or so for me to have a word that I felt described how I've always seen the world. So it's like a 30-year window where you're not capable of articulating and describing your surrounding.
Yeah, especially considering that that's something you noticed as a kid and you still weren't able to, like, people still don't see that as adults.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I will say, well, like, the thing that's weird about, not weird, but as a kid, you're just feelings.
Right.
Like, you feel the stuff as a child. And so the goal is that you feel something, and then that feeling resonates and connects with other people, and you have, like, you join people that have the same feeling.
Yeah.
I'm this person who felt something that I don't think most people felt. And so then I didn't have that, like, emotive connection to, like, really anyone around me.
You weren't able to find other kids who felt the same way, or even adults for that matter.
Right.
It's not like you were able to communicate how you felt, and then you were able to find a community around you, or a group of people who felt the same way.
Yeah, and it's super interesting in hindsight, where, like, to other people, you know, I played sports and I had fun, I had friends and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, I kind of had, like, a fairly lonely, like, childhood.
Yeah.
But, you know, you guys know me. I'm funny. I can have fun. I can make friends and everything. But, like, there's, like, a loneliness to it. But to me, I never felt lonely because this is the only way I knew how to see the world. And if people didn't understand it, then that was fine because, like, the space I was living in was already meaningless.
Yeah.
So, like,
you already got it.
Right. So, like, if they didn't want to be around me, I was perfectly okay with that because I knew that if they wanted to be around me, the society I lived in meant that if they changed their mind tomorrow based on absolutely nothing that I've ever done, they'd be perfectly empowered and feel justified in doing so. So there was no, like consistency.
Yeah, you didn't get
in the space. So, like, I didn't actually feel lonely. It was just like I'm just in a place that doesn't matter.
You know, I think what's so interesting, I think when I talk to you, I think of, like, the people that kind of get that understanding of the world, like, late in life and how they kind of, like, grapple with it, or, like, to understand that, you know, how I see it is, like, we're fucked, right? Or, like, it's all going to shit, and it's always been to shit. But someone who understood that from, like, an early childhood, or someone who was introduced to that topic, like, early on, you're kind of at what I would call an advantage of everyone else when it comes to when you're finally figuring out, like, oh wow, maybe the structures that are built up don't make sense, or maybe I believe in something that it wasn't. You know, when that kind of those structures come crumbling down, when you realize that at an older age, that could be shocking to the system.
Right.
Where you've kind of already understood it, or there's many people, you know, it's like black folks in general who parents may have been woke for some sense, and it's like, okay, you're kind of ahead of what you're against. You know, so I think it's really, I relate to that. I mean, from my childhood as well, kind of being, like, different than everyone in your environment, and I understand, like, the loneliness of, like, I even have to deal with even the dumbing yourself down, as you would call it, to, like, relate to everyone else, or, like, even in school and things like that, and how that's, like, a form, that's why I love it, because that's, like, a form of ethnocide that like, you end up pushing out.
Yeah, you're encouraged to kill your own internal culture so that you can, like, thrive in a place that lacks culture.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's so many pressures like that, and yeah, like.
So how does the Sustainable Culture Lab that you've, you know, established now, like, work against that, and now that leads to, like, the other word that you created as well too? Yeah.
So great question. So with SCL, there's a series of things that we're doing. But first and foremost, we have to inject the language of ethnocide into the space, because to make proper change, you have to be able to have the right types of conversations.
Yeah.
And the conversations that we have in our society have an underpinning, a foundation of justifying ethnocide, and that could be 1%, it could be 100%, but that justification of ethnocide, to whatever degree it is, undermines our capacity to make the change we want in the world. And so making sure that we inject ethnocide, the word, into the discourse, so that people can then like look at their environment slightly differently and feel empowered that they have the language to articulate what is wrong, then that allows like a radical amount of change to happen. Because it's kind of say something bad's happening to you and you're screaming for help and like no one can hear you. Well, then nothing's going to change. Like something that bad thing's just going to continue to happen. Now, say you don't even know what the word help is.
Right.
Then you're even at like a further disadvantage. And I think as a society, like that's our discourse without the word ethnocide. Like we'll try to scream for help, but the word help has never been created.
Right, so you don't know what you're asking for.
Right, you might be asking for something close to help.
I want something good to happen to me, so that would help me through this situation or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the first part of SCL is empowering Americans, especially communities of color, people that really emotionally, viscerally need to be able to use this word to describe their environment, empowering them to do that. And then the other side is we've lived in a place that's ethnocidal and people aren't aware of it. And so then once you see it and you see how ethnocide is everywhere and it shapes our entire society, people get quite sad.
Right.
And then they also realize that they don't know how to do something besides ethnocide. So now you have to give another word and like an opposing philosophy to empower people to create stuff that counters the division of ethnocide.
Right.
And real quick, I'm not sure if I've fully like defined ethnocide on this radio show, but so real quick, it's the destruction of culture and the preservation of the people. So with the transatlantic slave trade, you took Europeans took African bodies from the continent with the goal of stripping African people of their culture so that they were only like African in body, and that body could be used and exploited in the New World in perpetuity. And then colonizers built their entire civilization around the hope that this division would remain forever, where like cities were built this way. People were given names such as white and black to denote who gets to be exploited and who gets to exploit, who gets to benefit from systemic systems of exploitation and who gets to suffer from these systems. Towns were built with like railroad tracks dividing the black side and the white side, and like money gets allocated to white schools and not black schools and all sorts of stuff just to continue this ethnocidal division. And our language regarding race derives from ethnocide. Europeans created races so that they could be divided, and it could be easy to determine who gets exploited and who doesn't. And then there's linguistic impediments where, as an African American, if I talk about the United States, there's a cultural pressure for me to say we. Where it's like, no, I didn't have anything to do with these ideas that these Europeans came up with. Like, Europeans forcefully prevented anyone that looked like me from having any influence on these ideas. Right. So should I say we?
Right. Does that apply? Right.
Of course not. But culturally, there's a narrative that we're together. No, that just foundationally doesn't exist. And so once you see that, it's tough to deal with. So you have to come up with another thing, which is the second word, which is evtopia, and that's spelled EU-topia. And EU in Greek means good, and topia in Greek means place. And this kind of is like, I view it as an extension, a progression beyond the word utopia, because the word utopia is a joke. It's a satire, and the word was invented in 1516 by Thomas More. He wrote this satirical novel, Utopia, and he made this word out of the blue for this book. And he got the Greek prefix EU, which is pronounced ev, and that means good, and the Greek prefix OU, which means non-existent, and he cut off the E and cut off the O to make a new word that means non-existent good place. And so after he made this, Europeans then went on this bizarre journey to find and create
utopia.
utopias or non-existent good places, and that's been a disaster. And so my philosophy on countering ethnocide is to create good places that can exist, which would be an evtopia, which is good and place put together.
Yeah. So what do you think is in it, now that we have defined ethnocide and we've defined evtopia, and now, so the Sustainable Culture Lab, its goals is essentially to help people find their evtopia, or to create that place, or how does that work together?
Or is the SCL basically your version of creating the good place where people can then take a little piece of that and create, it's like planting a tree and then the roots growing out?
So yes to all of that, but there's a lot of complexity to it because so to create a good place, it's a micro and a macro engagement where you have to help and educate people to make themselves, like, individually a good place. And then you also have to create the concepts for how do you create collective good places. And so a great example, I use this a lot, is the plaza, like the town square, where towns will have an understanding, they'll have a language to articulate the necessity of having a town square where people come, regardless of class, to the middle of town to do kind of nothing. Like, they just socialize and hang out. It's not related to a job. They're not there to buy something. They're just there to socialize and build community and culture. And that is like the heartbeat of the city.
Yeah.
Like, the U.S. is a place that has always been opposed to that type of environment, especially when it comes to, like, communities of colors, African Americans.
Yeah.
They created laws to prevent us from gathering, because once we could gather, that would give us the opportunity to preserve our African culture, or articulate and discuss,
or share
ideas and talk about how horrible chattel slavery was, and that we need to do something to stop this from happening. And so culturally, like, America has prevented the creation of good places,
right?
Which, like, plazas. So, like, coming up with ideas and policies and language to articulate the necessity of that, because this is based in DC, and DC is this really fascinating environment where there's, like, the local DC community that's a very strong African American community that's been here for a long time in DC and Maryland. But then there's the global community of people all around the world who, whether they are successful or not, their idea for being here in many ways is to create good places,
right?
To make the world a better place. And so here, having a think tank in DC, and also due to there being a vibrant African American community, there's a lot of art and culture and all that stuff. Having this combination, this mixture, while it can empower the communities of color in DC, but it can also result in policies and papers that congressmen and influential people can look at and say, this is how I can articulate what good place policies could be. And so that's why it's a cultural think tank, where, like, DC is a place for a think tank, but the focus of the think tank is culture, and the need for creating good culture. I'm going to be a little bit more of a nerd here, but there's another example of, like, an evtopian concept that I'm really excited about. It's this Dutch word polderen.
Oh, you haven't talked to me about this one yet.
Oh man, it's the best. And so so the Dutch, this is just fascinating. Like, a third of that country is below sea level. And around the 1100s, they said, hey, we need more land, so we're gonna build dikes, dams, windmills to pump out water and make the land that's below the sea like our land. And so in so doing that, the land that they created, that they reclaimed, is called a polder.
Okay.
But when you make that polder, you know that when a big storm comes,
it's gonna go away.
It could go away.
Yeah.
And so they have this philosophy of polderen that essentially means that everyone will put aside their differences, whether they, that's political, religious, whatever, to save the polder.
To save the land.
To save the land. So there's a communal, and so poldering, this idea, like, shapes the Dutch parliament. Like, they have never needed a majority party to run their government.
Because it's always, like, for the good of everyone or for the good of
it's always poldering. They're like, we can always form a coalition. We can always come together to pass the laws that are, like, necessary for the people because of poldering. And so that's poldering, but then you think about it, and, like, most societies, the land is already there. You know?
Yeah.
Like, you even if you're an explorer, like, you cross that mountain, and it's like, oh, wow, there's land, and we're just going to live on this land.
All right.
The Dutch are like, let's make land. And so we're going to strategically put a canal here, a dike here, a windmill here to make this amount of land available for the community.
Right.
And so now, like, every inch of a polder starts as communal space. And then you put houses on it. Then you turn it into farmland. Then you do whatever. But, like, it starts as the communal space because the community comes together.
Right, to get it.
And makes it. And as the Dutch population has grown over the 20th century, they just said, we'll just make more polders.
Right.
Like, we'll just make new land.
Right.
And they've been quite ambitious and have made, like, 4 pretty massive polders in the 20th century alone.
Wow.
To just accommodate for more people. So that's, like, collective land. That then your house is on that. And so, like, the couple times I've been to the Netherlands, I've always been astonished that people leave their curtains open. Like, when you're when you're in your house, your curtains are open and you can look and see into your neighbor's house.
Because it's like my space is your space, and we're all kind of, even though I'm in my own home, it's like, it's built on community land, so it's kind of like
it's our space.
How you interpret or how you move through life, understanding shared space.
Yeah. And there's a whole understanding that, like, the community helps raise each other's kids. You know, like, you can leave your kid with the neighbor. They got you. Like, the blinds are open. Yeah. You know? Yeah,
it's like, it kind of lends to living life like that.
Right.
Those small actions.
And so I think this, like this, my idea of utopian environment, you know, it's not a perfect thing. It's not a utopia where it's perfection. There's no tension. There's not, like, there's a consistent amount of work that has to go into sustaining an utopian space. But this idea of polder that they do in the Netherlands, I just find really fascinating.
That's really dope. And you're going to send me on a YouTube tangent, like, probably later on this
year. Oh my God.
So here's a question. You know, we can talk about a lot of these ideas and these topics, but, you know, people are different kinds of learners. Some people are visual, some people are hands-on, some people, they just get it. So how do you kind of push out this information about Ethnocide, Ethtopia, Sustainable Culture Lab? Like, do you just go on podcasts and talk about it, or do you write about it? Like, how do you get people converted to this?
Well, I guess all of the above is the answer I have to give, because if I'm only good at writing and people need to get information many other ways, I have to find a way to become better at these other things, even things I'm not that fond of. So yeah, I go on podcasts. I write articles. I'm going to start writing more and more articles specifically talking about ethnocide and Ethtopia, using that language. It's kind of difficult to use language that people don't even know exists to write stuff. But there's going to be a growing shift towards that with Candor. We produced a zine. It's like a 20-page little booklet that describes the foundation of these ideas. And if you're in DC, come by the Eaton or come by Shopkeepers in the Northeast, and you can buy a copy. So we have social media. We have a website. It's SCL_community or SCL.community. The website is SCL.community. The social media, it's all SCL_community. And you can learn from that. We're coming up with an events schedule at Eaton. The goal is to have an event about every month, talking about some facet of either ethnocide and Ethtopia, and how you can use this language to improve your life. And we're going to continue developing more and more ways to get people to know this. I believe this is recorded, so that'll be on YouTube or something like that.
Yes, sir.
You know.
So I want to go back to something you said earlier about kind of art. You know, one of the big contributors to the zine and to your platform has been another photographer who's actually been a guest on our podcast, Kurth Bob. And you know, when he was on our podcast, he talked about kind of, you know, how he was introduced to these topics and how you know, same way that we have conversations here and we're talking about wellness and going through life, how he grasped onto your idea and then how it influenced his philosophy.
He talked about me?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Oh, okay.
How it influenced, you know, his philosophy and how that philosophy also influences his photography work and artwork that he puts out, his photography as art. And so I wanted to know kind of like, what are your thoughts on like this intersection between ethnocide, evtopia, and art and creation as a method of like explaining the idea?
Yeah. So art's essential to the work of SCL, and I should have said that earlier, because let's see. So philosophy is complicated. Like sometimes, you know, to really articulate a good philosophical idea, you'll need 400 pages, and a lot of times philosophers aren't the best writers. So if we're relying on a poorly written 400-page book to make that philosophy something that people can use, there's really not that much of a chance that people are going to use it. Right. But if that philosophy can manifest itself into art, such as like a photo or a painting that allows people to feel the philosophy and maybe have a word or a phrase that they can use to like empower them and focus them, then now you're really onto something. And historically, that's been, I think, the most successful way that philosophy has impacted people's lives in the West and in Europe. You know, I think one of the best examples is the Renaissance. Like the de Medici family were just these bankers that decided that they wanted to make Florence better, and so they invested in a philosopher, and they had the philosopher come by their house all the time, and they would have painters and sculptors come by the house and listen to the philosopher. And next thing you know, his philosophies were manifested in their paintings. The philosophy of town squares
came from
these types of conversations where you need to create spaces for people to gather regardless of class, you know, to sustain community. And when they gather in that place, you need to make sure that that place is beautiful and that it has stuff that encourages people to be their best selves. Yeah. And that's partially how the Renaissance was able to thrive.
What do you think was the impetus, this may be off track a little bit, but what do you think was the impetus for like that Medici family, that rich family, to like invest in the arts? Was it like, could it just start from like, I think this is cool and I want to see more of it in the world, so here, and now we have what we understand as how we live life?
You know, man, it's one of those things where I can't really answer. Like, I don't know why I saw the world how I saw the world. It's like, I didn't pick my brain to be in my head. Yeah. Like, it's just there. And it took me like 2 decades or so to figure out how that thing was working. Yeah. And so who knows what the de Medicis came up with or why they had this impetus. It could have been one of them that then convinced all the other ones. And, you know, it could have been a conversation that lasted 10 years. It could have been a conversation that lasted 5 minutes that completely like swayed the family. Like, well, you know what? Just to take a tangent and maybe clue you into a little bit of what I'm thinking. What I think about is like how we have like money and capitalism and how it leads us to a lot of bad things, or like ethnocide in general. And this is, if you're thinking about what you're saying, is like you had this family that now threw money behind, you know, creating art and creating Times Square. That actually was capitalism working for good. Well, so I guess that answer is kind of like how capitalism would want you to describe it, because I would see it as someone becoming a capitalist and getting all this money and then realizing it's not really making society as good as they would like it to be. Because like like if you're a banker, your job as a banker is mostly to like hold people's money
and make it more for you.
Well, frankly, like you need to hold people's money so that it's harder for them to get robbed.
Yeah.
And then you make money by like giving people loans so that they can then build stuff and create things, and you get interest off of those loans because then they make something that's profitable. So like the concept of being a banker is like a social good. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to provide a social good. And if you have all of this money and you're one of the wealthiest families in Europe, and Europe's still kind of in the dark ages, and you have a bunch of cash, you might look at it and say, capitalism hasn't benefited society to the degree that I thought it would be, because they straight up have a job that is the focal point of capitalism, which is moving money around.
Yeah.
Like, because this is wonky, but like there's a difference between money and capital. Like money is something that you can save. Once money is like no longer in circulation, it's no longer capital. Like capital is money and movement. And so like a banker, clearly a banker has to save and keep reserves for like the solvency of the bank. But what banks actually do is make sure that money is moving around so that people can use it to buy stuff and keep capitalism going.
Because if everybody was just holding cash and there was no intermediary, it wouldn't exchange hands and no other ideas could be made. You just have top and bottom.
Exactly. Like if I have a bunch of cash and it's just hidden in my mattress, that money
doesn't help anybody.
Doesn't exist to the world really until I make it emerge from my mattress. And then once it's emerged, now it can do stuff to benefit society. But up until then, it's like it doesn't even exist.
Yeah.
And that goes into the question of like, what's the purpose or meaning of money? Like money is a thing that you have that you use to buy stuff that has meaning, such as like food or a house or clothes, stuff that can provide you with meaning. But money itself doesn't provide any meaning. And the dynamic is that no matter how hungry you are, you don't need to eat 50 times a day.
Yeah.
You know, like there's going to be a cap on the amount of food you can eat. There's going to be a cap on the amount of clothes you can wear. There's going to be a cap on the amount of houses or cars you can have. So the stuff that has meaning, there's actually a ceiling.
Cap for,
there's a cap. You can hit the ceiling, and at a certain point, like if you have 10 houses, you're like, I'm not using 4 of these houses. I need to sell these.
That's a big bar. The things that you need, there's actually a cap for.
There's a ceiling. But money is a thing that you can constantly make an infinite amount of.
Yeah.
You can always get more money. And so as you make more money and you can't buy stuff that has meaning, now you have to find a way to make your money meaningful.
Yeah.
And that in many ways is the inversion of capitalism.
Right.
Because you're just acquiring capital because money's moving around. You know? And so like I would say that the Medicis, just like plenty of other people, like Karl Marx was funded by Engels, and his dad ran like a factory in England and just had a bunch of money, and Engels is like, we're making all this money by ruining people's lives and just locking them in factories for like 16 hours a day. Let me use this money to do something good, like make sure that Karl Marx is able to live and not be poor. Like a lot of really powerful thinkers were able to think because like capitalists got near the end of their professional career and realized that they have all this money, and that the return that they thought accumulating money was going to give them was not nearly as great as it should have been, and now they need to try to use that money for good.
So that goes back to what I was saying in like the beginning of our conversation, where it was like when you understood like the concept early on in your childhood about like why this was messed up, or like how you come into this in your 20s. Like you had older people with cash that were like, whoa, I didn't get this, and now they're having that crisis of thought, and now they're like using it to influence something in ways.
Yeah, 100%. Like you know, we live in a place that people try to derive meaning from money.
Right.
And having a lot of money should give you meaning, but like money is a thing that doesn't have meaning.
It doesn't have meaning.
It's supposed to be used to acquire things that give you meaning. But like if you have money in a couch and no one knows it exists, then it's meaningless until it emerges, and then you do something meaningful with it.
I dig it.
And so like it's so I don't know what the question was now.
Yeah, I don't know.
It was about the Medicis and how this came into being. So like, frankly, I think at a certain point people realize that they need to start using their resources, whether that's money or just being a nice person, to do stuff that is meaningful and can make the world a better place. because otherwise it's just like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And my goal with SCL is to empower people with language and ideas and philosophies to make the world better, and a key way to do that is to be able to articulate the flaws in the world that you currently live in.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Dope. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
As we wind things down, actually, I want to ask you, we've talked a lot about content and Ethnocide and Ethtopia, and so what kind of content have you been taking in recently, whether it's TV, movies, books, music, or anything that you see as like kind of creating that space of Ethtopia, or just something that like is inspiring you to think in those ways right now?
Well, so that's a good question, because I have been focused most of my life on articulating and understanding Ethnocide, and so the process of doing Ethtopian stuff is actually still like a daily struggle for me.
Yeah, hard for you.
I have habits more geared towards looking at like the ethnocidal abyss than creating Ethtopian space. So one thing I do here at Eton is I go to the meditation every day. That's quite helpful for me. I try to create routines where I wake up in the morning and articulate like positive messages and what I want to do throughout the day.
Yeah.
I ride my bike. That's something that really clears my head, and I try not to ride my bike too fast where I'm competing with cars, and it becomes like an activity that's just filled with anxiety and not just like casual contemplation and like meditation and movement as I like make sure my body doesn't fall apart. And so there's a lot of like micro Ethtopian stuff that I try to do to make sure that I'm good at it, because I need to be good at that and for my work.
It's like good at making yourself feel good.
Right. Like if I want to help people feel good and create good places and good spaces, I have to put forth the effort myself.
Yourself, right.
The key thing I think is to always acknowledge that it is a struggle. Like nothing in existence doesn't come with a struggle. Like you have to do things all the time. Like food just doesn't magically appear. You have to do something to get it. Like waking up in the morning, your body does ache. Like walking down the street, that's actually like a subtle pounding on your body every day. Right. These are just like struggles that we're so accustomed to that we don't perceive it as that. But it's all like a struggle, and you have to make sure that you have a philosophical, meaningful understanding as to why you do stuff, so that you feel empowered as you go through like that struggle. Yeah. And so I'm in a stage where I'm experimenting a lot, and to make sure I find the best routine for myself. But as for books, right now I'm working on a book talking about like ethnocide and Ethtopia, and I'm still in the describing the impacts of ethnocide. So the books that I'm reading right now are very ethnocidal. Yeah. And it means that I need meditation
to bring yourself back up. I can understand.
Are you gonna make it to meditation on time? You got
no,
40
I'm not.
minutes?
No.
We're gonna get you out of here. So with that being said, thanks for joining us today. I know you've already done the drop on like where people can find you, but again, where can people find more information about the Sustainable Culture Lab? How can they sign up for emails and things like that? Let us know.
Perfect. The website is scl.community. On that, you can learn about our work. You can sign up for the newsletter. You can send me emails. You can do that on Twitter. It's SCL_community. Instagram, it's SCL_community. My name is Barrett Holmes Pitner. I'm the only person that I know with that name. So if you Google that, you'll see me on the Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff.
On the internets.
And yeah, that's really it.
Amazing. Well, thank you for joining us, sir, and thank you to my co-host Fatih today. And you'll catch me, OG Baka, no longer the hair naughty guy body, on another episode of Activated. And maybe next time we'll see Moss with us too.
Yeah. That would be nice.
Yeah, that would be nice. All right, holla at us.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Handshakes. Well, thanks for listening.